The morning of November 8, 1943. Philippine Sea, approximately 200 miles east of Manila. Commander Dudley Walker Morton stood in the conning tower of USS Wahoo, his eyes fixed on the periscope as a Japanese convoy materialized through the grey dawn haze, 7 merchant ships, heavily laden, escorted by 2 destroyers. Through the lens, Morton could see the rising sun flags snapping in the wind, the rust streaks on hulls that had crossed too many voyages without proper maintenance. The convoy was steaming at 8 knots, zigzagging according to a pattern Morton had studied for months. He turned to his executive officer and spoke words that would be repeated in submarine wardrooms across the Pacific. "We're going in. Surface attack. All ahead flank." What Commander Morton couldn't know in that moment, what none of the American submarine commanders patrolling the Pacific could fully comprehend, was that they were about to wage the most successful unrestricted submarine campaign in naval history. A campaign that would sink more than 5 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping, a campaign that would starve Japan's war machine more effectively than any bombing raid or surface battle, and a campaign that would be conducted primarily by a single class of submarine, the Gato class, whose unassuming designation and relatively modest specifications concealed what would become the most lethal submarine design ever deployed in sustained combat. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Japanese Admiralty in Tokyo, in their headquarters overlooking the Imperial Palace, operated under assumptions that seemed unshakable in 1943. Their intelligence estimates, compiled by the 4th Fleet staff and distributed to convoy commanders throughout the Pacific, assessed American submarine capabilities as modest at best. Japanese naval doctrine, refined through decades of study and combat experience dating back to the Russo-Japanese War, held that submarines were reconnaissance vessels and opportunistic raiders. Dangerous, yes, but manageable through proper escort procedures and aggressive anti-submarine warfare. The idea that submarines alone could sever Japan's maritime supply lines, that underwater vessels could achieve what surface fleets and air power combined had failed to accomplish, seemed to contradict everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had learned about modern warfare. This confidence rested on experience. During World War I, German U-boats had indeed wreaked havoc on Allied shipping, but they had ultimately failed to starve Britain into submission. The convoy system, combined with improved depth charges and detection equipment, had rendered unrestricted submarine warfare a failed strategy by 1918. More recently, in the opening years of World War II, German U-boats in the Atlantic had achieved impressive tonnage figures, but at an unsustainable cost in submarines and crews. By 1943, Allied anti-submarine warfare had evolved to the point where U-boat losses exceeded their construction rate. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning against Germany's submarine force. Japanese naval planners, studying these Atlantic lessons carefully, concluded that submarines represented a serious but ultimately containable threat. Their merchant marine, they believed, could be protected through the same methods that were defeating German U-boats: armed escorts, convoy procedures, aggressive depth charge attacks, and air patrols in coastal waters. What the Japanese Admiralty failed to understand, what their intelligence officers couldn't comprehend from their headquarters in Tokyo, was that the Pacific War would be different in every way that mattered. Part 2. Building the World. Japanese Naval Doctrine. The Imperial Japanese Navy's approach to commerce. Protection in 1943 reflected decades of offensive-minded thinking. Since Admiral Togo's decisive victory at Tsushima Strait in 1905, where the Japanese fleet annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet in one of history's most complete naval victories, Japanese naval doctrine had focused almost exclusively on the decisive battle. The concept was simple and seductive. Build the most powerful battleships, train the most skilled crews, and achieve victory through a single climactic engagement that would destroy the enemy's will to continue fighting. Everything else, convoy escorts, anti-submarine warfare, merchant marine protection, was considered secondary to this primary mission. This bias toward offensive operations had consequences that would prove catastrophic. Japanese destroyer captains, trained to think of themselves as fleet scouts and torpedo attack specialists, considered escort duty beneath their dignity and training. When assigned to convoy protection, they often performed the mission with minimal enthusiasm and inadequate preparation. Japanese anti-submarine warfare tactics in 1943 remained essentially unchanged from those developed in the 1920s. Depth charge patterns were predictable. Sonar equipment, called hydrophone by Japanese operators, was inferior to American and British systems. Most critically, Japanese naval aviators received almost no training in anti-submarine patrol techniques. The idea of using precious aircraft and skilled pilots to hunt submarines, rather than to attack enemy carriers and battleships, seemed wasteful to commanders who dreamed of replicating Togo's triumph at Tsushima. The Japanese merchant marine itself, the vast fleet of cargo ships, tankers, and transports that carried the raw materials and fuel that sustained Japan's war effort, operated under peacetime assumptions well into 1944. Many merchant captains refused to sail in convoy, considering it an inefficient waste of time that reduced individual ship autonomy. Those who did accept convoy discipline often broke formation at night or in bad weather, confident that vast Pacific distances provided adequate protection from enemy submarines. Japanese merchant ships in 1943 rarely had military-grade radios. Communication between ships in convoy often depended on signal flags and Aldis lamps, making coordinated evasive maneuvers nearly impossible. Most cargo ships carried no weapons whatsoever. Those that did typically mounted a single machine gun or ancient deck gun, operated by minimally trained crew members who had never fired at a real target. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The institutional contempt for merchant marine protection ran deep in Japanese naval culture. At the Naval War College in Tokyo, where future admirals studied strategy and tactics, not a single course addressed convoy protection or anti-submarine warfare as primary subjects. The curriculum focused on battleship tactics, carrier operations, and torpedo attacks. Merchant shipping appeared only as logistical background, necessary but unglamorous. This educational bias produced a generation of Japanese naval officers who literally did not understand how modern industrial warfare depended on sustained maritime logistics. They could calculate gun ranges and torpedo spreads with mathematical precision, but they couldn't comprehend that oil tankers and iron ore carriers were more strategically important than battleships. Part 3. Building the World, the Japanese Merchant Marine Reality. The Japanese merchant marine in December 1941, when war began, totaled approximately 6 million tons of shipping. This figure included everything from modern 10,000-ton tankers to ancient coastal freighters that had been sailing Asian waters since before World War I. The fleet was diverse but aging. Most ships had been built in the 1920s and early 1930s. Fuel efficiency was poor by Western standards. Maintenance had been deferred throughout the 1930s as Japan's economy militarized. Many ships sailed with mechanical problems that would have kept them in port under peacetime safety regulations. Japan's geographic situation created absolute dependence on this merchant fleet. The home islands possessed almost no oil, limited coal deposits insufficient for industrial warfare, inadequate iron ore, no natural rubber, no bauxite for aluminum production, and food production that could feed perhaps 70% of the population under optimal conditions. Everything else, the petroleum that fueled ships and aircraft, the iron that became steel for weapons, the rice that fed soldiers, the rubber for vehicle tires, had to be imported by sea from the southern resource area, the territories Japan had conquered in Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies. The logistics were staggering. A single Japanese army division fighting in Burma or the Philippines required approximately 3,000 tons of supplies per month. The combined fleet's battleships and carriers consumed thousands of barrels of fuel oil daily. Aircraft factories needed steady streams of aluminum, rubber, and aviation fuel. The civilian population needed food imports to avoid famine. All of this material had to travel thousands of miles across ocean routes that grew longer as American forces advanced westward across the Pacific. Japanese planners in 1941 had calculated shipping requirements carefully. They estimated that Japan needed approximately 3 million tons of merchant shipping actively operating at any given time to sustain both military operations and minimal civilian needs. The 6 million ton total fleet provided what seemed like comfortable redundancy, enough ships to cover vessels under repair, those lost to accidents and storms, and anticipated war losses. The calculations assumed modest attrition rates based on World War I experience, perhaps 300,000 tons lost annually, easily replaceable through Japan's shipbuilding industry. These calculations, prepared by staff officers who understood logistics better than most Japanese naval officers, were presented to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo in late 1941. They included specific warnings. If merchant ship losses exceeded Japanese shipbuilding capacity, if the merchant fleet declined below critical thresholds, Japan's ability to continue fighting would be compromised regardless of battle outcomes. The warnings were noted, filed, and essentially ignored. Japanese naval leadership in 1941 was planning to win the war through decisive carrier battles and battleship engagements, not through the unglamorous arithmetic of merchant tonnage and replacement rates. The idea that American submarines, operating alone without the support of surface fleets or massive air campaigns, could sink enough Japanese merchant ships to strangle Japan's war economy seemed implausible. Submarines were dangerous, certainly, but they were not war-winning weapons. Or so Japanese admirals believed in December 1941, when the war was still young and victory seemed inevitable. The statistics began arriving at the Naval General Staff headquarters in Tokyo during the spring of 1942, typed on thin rice paper by junior officers who didn't fully comprehend what the numbers meant. March losses: 42 merchant ships totaling 132,000 tons. April losses: 31 ships, 106,000 tons. May losses: 47 ships, 168,000 tons. The officers who compiled these reports, working in cramped offices that smelled of cigarette smoke and seawater, carried on humid breezes from Tokyo Bay, noted the figures dutifully, but without alarm. War meant losses. Ships struck mines, encountered storms, suffered mechanical failures. Some losses to enemy submarines were inevitable. What these junior officers couldn't see, what their superiors refused to acknowledge, was the pattern emerging from those columns of numbers. American submarines were learning. Each patrol brought new tactical refinements. Commanders who survived their first war patrols returned with knowledge about Japanese convoy routes, escort procedures, and defensive weaknesses. The early caution that had characterized American submarine operations in 1942 was giving way to aggressive confidence. Commander Morton on Wahoo, Commander Sam Dealey on Harder, Commander Richard O'Kane on Tang, these men were developing hunting techniques that would be studied in naval academies for generations. The Gato-class submarines that carried out these attacks were purpose-built for Pacific warfare in ways that German U-boats were not. Each Gato boat stretched 311 feet in length, displaced 1,500 tons on the surface, and carried a crew of 80 officers and enlisted men. The specifications seemed modest compared to Japanese fleet submarines, which were larger and faster. But the Gatos possessed advantages that didn't appear in official specifications. They could dive to 300 feet, 100 feet deeper than Japanese submarines, providing crucial escape depth when pursued by destroyers. Their diesel engines, manufactured by General Motors and Fairbanks Morse, were reliable in ways that Japanese engines were not. Most critically, their 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, allowed sustained attacks without surfacing to reload. A Gato boat carried 24 torpedoes. That meant 24 chances to sink Japanese shipping before returning to Pearl Harbor or Fremantle for resupply. By September 1942, American submarines had sunk 93 Japanese merchant ships. By December, the total reached 134 ships, totaling nearly 600,000 tons. These numbers appeared in intelligence summaries circulated among senior Japanese naval officers, but they were consistently dismissed as exaggerated or attributed to causes other than submarine attack. Ships were reported sunk by submarines when they had actually struck mines, Japanese officers argued. Some losses reflected Allied air attacks misidentified by surviving crews. American submarine commanders were known to file inflated claims, counting damaged ships as sunk, attacking the same vessel multiple times, and reporting multiple sinkings. The skepticism wasn't entirely unreasonable. American submarines early in the war did suffer from a catastrophic torpedo problem. The Mark 14 torpedo, standard weapon for the entire submarine force, had two critical defects. The magnetic exploder, designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel and break its back, fired prematurely or not at all. The contact exploder, backup for the magnetic system, often failed on direct hits because the firing pin crushed on impact instead of triggering the detonator. Submarine commanders throughout 1942 filed furious reports about torpedoes that ran under targets without exploding, torpedoes that struck enemy hulls with metallic clangs and failed to detonate, torpedoes that circled back toward the launching submarine. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington, staffed by officers who had never faced enemy fire, insisted the torpedoes were perfect and the submarine commanders were incompetent. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The torpedo crisis wasn't fully resolved until late 1943, when submarine commanders simply disconnected the magnetic exploders and field-modified the contact detonators. But even with defective torpedoes, American submarines were sinking Japanese shipping faster than Japan's shipyards could build replacements. Japanese shipyards in 1942 produced approximately 600,000 tons of new merchant shipping. Losses that same year totaled 980,000 tons. The gap, 380,000 tons, came directly out of Japan's maritime reserve. The comfortable redundancy that Japanese planners had calculated in 1941 was disappearing, and the Japanese Admiralty, still focused on carrier battles and battleship engagements, still dreaming of a decisive Tsushima-style victory, barely noticed the arithmetic of national strangulation. Commander Dudley Walker Morton brought USS Wahoo back to Pearl Harbor in February 1943 after a patrol that Submarine Force Headquarters would later classify as the most aggressive ever conducted. Morton had sunk 9 Japanese ships totaling 20,000 tons in 3 weeks. He had attacked convoys in shallow water where Japanese commanders assumed submarines couldn't operate. He had conducted surface gun attacks against small vessels, using Wahoo's deck guns to save torpedoes for larger targets. Most audaciously, he had penetrated Wewak Harbor on the northern coast of New Guinea, a supposedly protected anchorage where Japanese shipping gathered under the protection of shore batteries and air patrols, and had fired all remaining torpedoes at anchored transports before escaping through the harbor entrance at flank speed while Japanese destroyers scrambled to pursue. The patrol report that Morton submitted, typed on flimsy paper that still exists in naval archives, described actions that seemed reckless to older submarine commanders but revolutionary to younger officers who studied Morton's tactics. He had stayed on the surface during attacks whenever possible, using Wahoo's superior surface speed to outmaneuver escorts. He had attacked at dawn and dusk, when Japanese lookouts were most likely to be affected by changing light conditions. He had closed to point-blank range, sometimes inside 1,000 yards, where torpedo run time was measured in seconds, and Japanese escorts couldn't depress their guns enough to target Wahoo's low profile. Morton's executive officer, Richard O'Kane, who would later command his own submarine and become the highest-scoring American submarine ace, called Morton's approach aggressive to the point of madness, but madness that worked. Japanese convoy commanders operating in the Southwest Pacific began reporting in March 1943 that American submarines were no longer behaving according to expected patterns. The submarines were attacking in daylight. They were attacking multiple times during a single convoy passage. They were attacking in shallow coastal waters where submarines supposedly couldn't dive deep enough to escape depth charge attacks. These reports, transmitted by radio to 4th Fleet headquarters in Rabaul and forwarded to Tokyo, described tactics that seemed to violate fundamental submarine doctrine. Japanese anti-submarine warfare procedures, developed over decades, assumed submarines were cautious vessels that attacked from maximum range, fired one spread of torpedoes, then dove deep and retreated. Morton and commanders like him were demonstrating that submarines could be surface raiders, aggressive hunters that pressed attacks until all torpedoes were expended. The evidence that should have prompted Japanese naval headquarters to fundamentally reassess convoy protection procedures arrived in May 1943. That month, American submarines sank 36 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 129,000 tons. More critically, 3 major troop convoys bound for New Guinea were intercepted and savaged by submarine attacks. The transport, Kikuzuki Maru, carrying 1,200 troops from Shanghai to Rabaul, was torpedoed by USS Trigger and sank in 9 minutes. 800 soldiers drowned. The transport, Buenos Aires Maru, loaded with aviation supplies and engineering equipment for airfield construction in the Solomon Islands, was hit by 3 torpedoes from USS Guardfish and exploded when aviation fuel in the cargo holds ignited. The transport Australia Maru, carrying replacement pilots for Japanese naval air groups fighting in the South Pacific, was torpedoed by USS Gurnard off the coast of Bougainville. 392 men died, including 53 trained carrier pilots, whose replacement had taken 2 years and resources Japan could not spare. These were not random merchant ships carrying civilian cargo. These were critical military transports carrying troops and equipment that Japanese commanders in the Southwest Pacific desperately needed. The loss of the ships was serious. The loss of the trained men aboard, soldiers who had completed months of training, pilots who represented thousands of hours of flight instruction, and Japan's dwindling pool of aviation gasoline, was catastrophic. And the losses were occurring despite escort procedures. All 3 transports had been sailing in convoy with destroyer escorts. All 3 had been zigzagging according to prescribed patterns. All 3 had been in waters supposedly patrolled by Japanese aircraft. None of it had mattered. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo, receiving reports of these losses, finally began to comprehend that American submarines represented something different from the opportunistic raiders of Japanese doctrine. These were not vessels conducting reconnaissance missions with occasional attacks on targets of opportunity. These were dedicated commerce raiders, operating systematically to sever Japan's maritime supply lines. The American submarine force was small by surface navy standards, fewer than 200 boats operational at any time. But those boats were in the right ocean, built for long-range patrols, manned by volunteer crews who received better training than their Japanese counterparts, and commanded by officers who were developing tactics specifically designed to kill merchant shipping. Commander Morton's aggressive approach, initially considered reckless by conservative submarine force leadership, was being adopted by commanders throughout the Pacific. The hunting techniques that Morton demonstrated on Oahu, the aggressive surface attacks and point-blank torpedo shots, were becoming standard procedure. By June 1943, the mathematics that Japanese logistical planners had warned about in 1941 were becoming undeniable reality. Japan's merchant fleet, which had totaled 6 million tons at the war's start, had declined to 4.8 million tons. Losses were accelerating. June losses, 33 ships, 122,000 tons. July losses, 39 ships, 157,000 tons. August losses, 29 ships, 147,000 tons. Japanese shipyards, working at maximum capacity with steel allocations that competed with warship construction and army equipment production, were completing approximately 70,000 tons of new merchant shipping monthly. Losses were averaging 140,000 tons monthly. The gap, 70,000 tons every 30 days, represented shipping capacity that could never be recovered. The impact on military operations was immediate and measurable. Army divisions fighting in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands reported chronic shortages of ammunition and food. Units that were supposed to receive 3,000 tons of supplies monthly were receiving 1,500 tons or less. Soldiers were reduced to 1,200 calories daily, half the ration allocated to troops in China. Artillery batteries conserved shells, firing only at confirmed targets. Ammunition for small arms was rationed. Soldiers joked bitterly that they were issued 3 rounds per day, 1 for the enemy, 1 for themselves if captured, and 1 to trade for food with local populations. The naval situation was even worse. The combined fleet's battleships and carriers consumed massive quantities of fuel oil. Every sortie by a battleship division burned thousands of barrels of precious petroleum. The mobile fleet, Japan's primary carrier striking force, required approximately 40,000 barrels of fuel oil monthly just to maintain training operations. Combat operations doubled or tripled that consumption. The oil had to come from refineries in the Dutch East Indies and Borneo, transported by tanker across thousands of miles of ocean that American submarines patrolled constantly. By August 1943, Japanese naval planners were calculating fuel reserves in weeks rather than months. Major fleet operations had to be approved by headquarters in Tokyo based on fuel availability. Admirals who commanded powerful carrier divisions found themselves unable to conduct combat operations because tankers carrying fuel to forward bases had been sunk by American submarines. The psychological impact on Japanese naval officers exceeded the material losses. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been built on assumptions of technical superiority and tactical excellence. Japanese destroyers were faster than American destroyers. Japanese torpedoes were more powerful. Japanese night fighting doctrine was superior. These beliefs had been confirmed by victories throughout 1942. But submarines operated in a different realm, where traditional naval advantages meant nothing. Destroyers couldn't outrun submarines that attacked from ambush. Torpedoes couldn't hit targets that remained underwater. Night fighting skills were useless against enemies who attacked invisibly from beneath the surface. American submarines were negating every advantage that Japanese naval forces had trained for decades to exploit. Staff officers in Tokyo, reviewing loss reports through the summer of 1943, began including language in intelligence summaries that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Phrases like merchant shipping situation critical and maritime supply lines threatened appeared in documents circulated to senior commanders. Recommendations for fundamental changes in convoy procedures, including dedicating significant destroyer strength to escort duty and withdrawing experienced destroyer commanders from offensive operations to train convoy protection specialists, were drafted and submitted to the Naval General Staff. Most recommendations were rejected or implemented half-heartedly. The institutional bias toward offensive operations remained too strong. Japanese admirals in mid-1943 were still planning for the decisive battle that would turn the war, still believing that destroying the American Pacific Fleet in a single climactic engagement would render merchant shipping protection unnecessary. But the numbers told a different story. Between December 1941 and September 1943, American submarines had sunk approximately 350 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 1.4 million tons. The Gato-class submarines, those unglamorous vessels with modest specifications and unassuming designations, were accomplishing what carrier raids and surface battles had not. They were severing Japan's connection to the resources that sustained industrial warfare. They were starving the Japanese war machine systematically, one tanker and one freighter at a time, and they were doing it with a force that never exceeded 60 submarines on patrol simultaneously. Commander Morton wouldn't survive to see the final victory. Wahoo would be lost with all hands during a patrol in the Sea of Japan in October 1943. But the tactics Morton pioneered, the aggressive approach that seemed reckless to conservative commanders but proved devastatingly effective in practice, would be adopted by American submarine commanders throughout the Pacific. The toll would continue mounting through 1944 and into 1945 until Japanese merchant shipping essentially ceased to exist, and Japan's ability to continue fighting collapsed, not from battlefield defeats, but from the simple inability to transport the fuel, food, aid and raw materials that modern warfare required. By January 1944, the Japanese merchant marine existed in a state of systematic collapse that no amount of tactical adjustment could reverse. The total operational tonnage had fallen below 4 million tons, a threshold that Japanese logistical planners had identified in 1941 as the absolute minimum required to sustain both military operations and civilian survival. Ships that remained afloat were increasingly old, poorly maintained vessels that had been pulled from coastal routes and pressed into long-distance convoy duty. Crews were inexperienced replacements, civilian sailors who had been operating fishing boats or small cargo vessels and now found themselves navigating 1,000-mile routes through submarine-infested waters. The institutional knowledge that had sustained Japan's merchant marine through decades of peacetime operations, the experienced captains who understood weather patterns and navigation, the chief engineers who could coax maximum performance from aging engines, was being killed faster than replacements could be trained. The Japanese Admiralty's response to this crisis revealed how completely the institutional bias toward offensive operations had compromised rational strategic thinking. In February 1944, with merchant shipping losses averaging 200,000 tons monthly, the Naval General Staff approved construction plans for the Yamato-class battleship Shinano, converting the hull into an aircraft carrier that would require 12,000 tons of steel and 18 months of construction time. Those resources, redirected toward merchant ship construction, could have produced 30 cargo vessels or 15 tankers. But the battleship mentality remained dominant. Japanese admirals in 1944 were still planning for the climactic surface engagement that would justify every strategic decision made since Tsushima in 1905. The human cost of this institutional failure manifested in ways that official casualty figures never captured. Merchant sailors serving on Japanese cargo ships in 1944 faced mortality rates that exceeded those of frontline infantry units. Ships sailed undermanned because qualified sailors were becoming impossible to find. Those who did sail often lacked basic survival equipment. Lifeboats were missing or poorly maintained. Life preservers were filled with kapok that had rotted from moisture and no longer provided flotation. Radio equipment, when it existed, was often non-functional. Ships torpedoed at night in the middle of the Pacific left survivors floating in darkness, without distress signals, without hope of rescue, waiting for death from exposure or sharks. The tanker Kyokai Maru, torpedoed by USS Poji in March 1944 while carrying aviation fuel from Borneo to the Philippines, illustrated the cascading consequences of inadequate merchant marine protection. The ship sank in 4 minutes after a single torpedo struck the forward fuel tanks and ignited a fireball visible for 20 miles. 43 crew members died in the initial explosion. The remaining survivors, 28 men floating in fuel-contaminated water, were not rescued. Japanese escort vessels, following doctrine that prioritized hunting the attacking submarine over rescuing survivors, spent 6 hours dropping depth charges in a futile pursuit of Poji. By the time the destroyers returned to search for survivors, all had drowned or died from fuel oil inhalation. The aviation fuel that Kyokai Maru carried, 6,000 barrels that could have sustained Japanese air operations in the Philippines for 2 weeks, was lost. The experienced merchant crew, men who collectively represented decades of maritime knowledge, was lost. The ship itself, a modern tanker built in 1939, was lost. All this for the sake of pursuing a submarine that escaped undamaged. Intelligence reports reaching American submarine headquarters in Pearl Harbor through the spring of 1944 confirmed that Japanese merchant shipping was entering terminal decline. Convoy routes were being abandoned. Critical supply runs to forward bases were being cancelled because no ships were available. The Southern Resource Area, those conquered territories in Southeast Asia and the Dutch East Indies that were supposed to supply Japan with oil and raw materials, was becoming economically useless because nothing could transport the resources to Japan. Oil sat in storage tanks in Borneo. Iron ore piled up on docks in Malaya. Rubber rotted in warehouses in Singapore. All of it useless, because the ships that should have carried these materials to Japanese factories were resting on the Pacific floor, sent there by Gato-class submarines, whose crews would never know the strategic impact of their individual patrols. The final statistics of the American submarine campaign in the Pacific, compiled by naval historians after the war, revealed an unprecedented achievement in maritime warfare. Between December 1941 and August 1945, American submarines sank 1,178 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5,320,000 tons. These numbers, typed neatly in post-war assessment documents, represented approximately 60% of all Japanese merchant shipping lost during the war. Submarines also sank 214 Japanese naval vessels, including 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. But the merchant shipping atoll remained the submarine force's most significant contribution to Allied victory. The Gato-class submarines, those workhorses of the Pacific Campaign, accounted for the majority of these sinkings. 77 Gato boats were commissioned between 1941 and 1943. They conducted approximately 1,500 war patrols, collectively. They operated from Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, Brisbane, and later from forward bases in the Philippines and Marianas. They patrolled waters from the Aleutians to the Java Sea, from the Japanese home islands to the Indian Ocean. 19 Gato boats were lost during the war, a casualty rate of approximately 25% that was sobering but far lower than the 80% casualty rate suffered by German U-boats in the Atlantic. The human cost on both sides told stories that pure tonnage figures couldn't capture. American submarine force casualties totaled 3,505 officers and men killed in action, approximately 22% of all submarine personnel who served. These men died in ways that left no bodies to recover, no graves for families to visit. They died when depth charges crushed submarine hulls at 400 feet depth, when torpedo explosions broke boats in half, when Japanese aircraft caught surfaced submarines and bombed them into fragments. The submarine force suffered the highest casualty rate of any American military service during World War II. The men who served knew the statistics. They volunteered anyway. Japanese merchant sailor casualties exceeded 100,000 men killed. These deaths occurred far from home, in waters thousands of miles from Japan, witnessed by no one except the men who died alongside them. Most Japanese merchant sailors killed during the war have no known graves. Their names appear on memorial lists in Japanese ports, but their bodies rest in wreckage scattered across the Pacific floor. The institutional contempt that Japanese naval leadership showed for merchant marine protection extended even to casualty recording. Many merchant ship losses were never officially documented. Crews simply disappeared, ships failed to reach port, and no investigation followed. Families received notifications that their sons or husbands were missing, presumed lost at sea, with no details about when or where or how. The economic impact of the submarine campaign proved decisive in ways that surface battles never achieved. By mid-1945, Japan's oil imports had fallen to approximately 7% of 1941 levels. Steel production had declined by 60%. Food imports had essentially ceased, leading to widespread urban malnutrition. The combined fleet, that powerful naval force that had dominated the Pacific in 1942, remained largely in port through 1945, not because of battle damage, but because fuel oil couldn't be transported from refineries to naval bases. The massive battleships, Yamato and Musashi, embodiments of Japanese naval power, conducted their final operations on one-way fuel loads because Japan couldn't provide enough fuel oil for round-trip missions. The irony that Japanese naval historians would note in post-war analyses was that submarines, the weapons system that Japanese doctrine had dismissed as secondary to battleships and carriers, proved more strategically decisive than the expensive capital ships that had consumed so much of Japan's naval construction budget. The Yamato-class battleships, each costing as much to build as 1,000 merchant ships, achieved nothing of strategic significance before being sunk by American aircraft. The Gato-class submarines, built for a fraction of battleship construction costs, strangled Japan's war economy and made continued resistance materially impossible. The decisive battle that Japanese admirals had trained for, planned for, dreamed about since Tsushima never occurred. The war was won instead through the unglamorous arithmetic of tonnage sunk versus tonnage built, through patient patrols conducted by submarines, whose crews endured weeks of boredom punctuated by minutes of terror, through a campaign that validated every warning that Japanese logistical planners had issued in 1941 and that Japanese naval leadership had ignored. Commander Dudley Walker Morton never saw the final victory he helped achieve. Wahoo, on its 7th war patrol, penetrated the Sea of Japan through the dangerous La Perouse Strait in October 1943. Morton's mission was to attack Japanese shipping in waters the Japanese considered safe, home waters, where merchant ships sailed without escorts and captains didn't bother zigzagging. Wahoo sank 4 ships in 5 days. On October 11, 1943, while attempting to exit through La Pérouse Strait, Wahoo was detected by Japanese aircraft and attacked with depth charges. The boat was lost with all hands, 80 men including Morton and Executive Officer Richard O'Kane, who had transferred to new construction and wasn't aboard for this final patrol. The Japanese reported sinking a submarine in that location. American authorities classified Wahoo as missing and presumed lost. Morton's body, like those of 3,000 other American submariners killed during the war, was never recovered. The tactics Morton pioneered, the aggressive approach that seemed reckless to older commanders but proved devastatingly effective in practice, became standard doctrine for the American submarine force. His patrol reports, studied by commanders throughout the Pacific, provided a template for conducting commerce warfare in the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean. The officers who learned from Morton's example, men like Richard O'Kane, who survived Wahoo's 5th patrol and went on to command Tang, like Sam Dealey on Harder, like Gene Fluckey on Barb, accounted for a disproportionate share of Japanese shipping sunk during the war. They proved that submarines commanded by aggressive, intelligent officers could achieve strategic results that entire fleets of surface ships could not. The Japanese recognition of their catastrophic failure in merchant marine protection came too late to matter. By early 1945, with American forces capturing Iwo Jima and preparing to invade Okinawa, Japanese naval leadership finally implemented comprehensive convoy protection measures. Destroyers were dedicated to escort duty. Anti-submarine warfare training became mandatory. Convoy procedures were standardized. But the measures addressed a problem that had already destroyed Japan's ability to continue fighting. The merchant fleet that these improved procedures were meant to protect had been reduced to approximately 1 million tons, 1/6 of the December 1941 total. The ships that remained were coastal vessels unsuitable for long-distance convoy duty. The experienced crews were dead, the institutional knowledge was gone. The broader lesson that military historians extracted from the submarine campaign validated strategic principles that warfare theorists had understood since antiquity. Modern industrial warfare depends absolutely on logistics and supply lines. Destroying an enemy's ability to transport resources can be more decisive than destroying combat forces. 1,000 transport ships sinking invisibly across thousands of miles of ocean can have greater strategic impact than a single climactic battle where battleships exchange gunfire. These lessons, written in the detailed post-war assessments produced by American and Japanese naval historians, influenced Cold War submarine doctrine and shaped naval strategic thinking for decades. The memorial in Pearl Harbor that honors American submarine force casualties includes Morton's name, along with 3,504 other officers and men who never came home. Japanese memorials in ports throughout Japan list merchant sailors lost at sea, names that fill pages of memorial books, men whose deaths received no recognition during the war and minimal acknowledgement afterward. The Gato-class submarines themselves, those utilitarian vessels that won the Pacific War's most significant campaign, were almost all scrapped after 1945. A handful survive as museum ships, floating monuments to a campaign that demonstrated how unglamorous weapons systems operated by volunteer crews can achieve decisive strategic results that expensive capital ships cannot. The story that began with Commander Morton studying a Japanese convoy through Wahoo's periscope in November 1943 ended with Japan's surrender in August 1945. The connection between those two moments, between individual submarine patrols and national capitulation, illustrates how modern warfare rewards sustained systematic pressure more than spectacular tactical victories. Japanese admirals in 1943 were shocked when American submarines began sinking merchant ships at unprecedented rates. They remained shocked, unable to adapt their institutional biases and offensive-minded doctrine, while submarines destroyed Japan's maritime economy systematically and made continued resistance materially impossible. The shock came not from encountering superior technology or tactics, but from confronting a truth that contradicted everything Japanese naval doctrine had taught for 40 years. That submarines, patient and persistent, could win wars that battleships and carriers could not. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.